Well, thank you again very, very much. And it is a true privilege to be here. I always say that, it's nice to be among a Christian family. And I was telling a friend that I was coming up here, and I said it really does feel like I'm going home to meet family. Joe brought up a good point. The kind of research that I do is not exactly cheery stuff. And I think most of us would rather do something else. You'd rather just report on all the wonderful things happening. But with regard to where we are today, this field of research to me is quite fascinating. And so I wanted to talk this afternoon about how Israel is treated specifically by Christian media in this country. And as I said this morning about the millennials, this is also a really underreported story. Those of us who've been in the church a long time, it's very obvious that we have sort of sensed things shifting, right? You know something's off, but you just don't know exactly what or why, but you know things are changing. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and I'll get more into that a little bit later. But I also always love to know why things are the way they are. What are the root causes of something? And I really believe that what we're seeing play out, not just in the wider culture, but within evangelicalism, is the end result, almost the end result, of what started in the late 19th century in this country, when liberalism came into the church. This isn't part of the topic today, but I'll just mention that the catalyst for that really was Darwinian philosophy. And once Darwin and his friends, started figuring out how to market evolutionary theory to America, the clock started ticking then. And so, oddly enough, the leaders in this country who were most eager to spread Darwinian philosophy and evolution were the pastors. Isn't that weird? Herbert Spencer came over, Spencer of the survival of the fittest phrase. He's the one that coined that, not Darwin. So Spencer was one of Darwin's contemporaries, a hardcore evolutionist in England. He came to the U.S. in 1882 on a lecture tour, and he was brought here by Henry Ward Beecher, the very famous New York pastor who was, in terms of fame, understand, he was the Billy Graham of his day. He was probably America's pastor. So anyway, that really began the slide and brings us to where we are today. But as I said this morning, once you know what somebody believes about the beginning of the Bible, you know what they believe about the rest of it. And a person's view of Genesis will color what he thinks about the Jewish people and about Israel and ultimately, by extension, Bible prophecy. So once Genesis was being debated and twisted and changed, that began to change some views about Israel, and hopefully I'll illustrate for you this afternoon where that has brought us. I started in Christian book publishing 25 years ago this year, and I was an editor for a publisher, and I was so green and naive, and I was so earnest, and it took me a few months to figure out something was a little off in Christian media. And then over the next few years, it was really off. Back then, and our company was one of several doing this, but there were millions of Bible prophecy books being printed and sold. And a good chunk of that narrative was, of course, about Israel. And I think America has always been pro-Israel, which obviously explains a lot of God's favor on this country, I believe. But largely the church was as well. A couple of things changed that. The 6-Day War changed it in a big way, because now all of a sudden Israel wasn't the underdog. They weren't David anymore. Now to people they were Goliath. They were Goliath in how they deal with the Palestinians. But the other thing was just the steady drip of liberalism, which started in the seminaries. You can read the literature from 80 years ago. Read it from the 1940s, the 1950s, when we think that everything was idyllic in this country. It was, Father knows best and stuff. But not in some of the dark halls of the seminaries where they were openly questioning the Bible. It's what I call the deconstruction of the Bible. And by the way, I do think it's very important that we as individuals get in a mindset that we have to try to affect change where we are. And you can do that wherever you are, as I mentioned this morning. Start paying attention and reading for yourself, and then tell others what is happening so that they'll understand as well. But you can look at some of those some of the stuff that was in even Sunday school literature, and specifically the stuff that was aimed at kids, youth, and they were already trying to convince them that things like the Exodus was a myth. Much of the Old Testament was myth. So the church was incubating in this kind of system for decades, so that what we're seeing in the last 5, 10, 15 years in the church, things that disturb us, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It didn't just fall out of the air. It had been around for a long time in the shadows. And once the seminaries had raised enough generations of pastors who believed this way, they were then ready to start changing the culture in the churches, and that's what they've done. So up until the 90s, 2000, and I can tell you as a person in publishing, the Y2K thing really did stop a lot of the prophecy material. It really did, for better or worse. And, Y2K had nothing to do with the Bible, but the perspective was that it did, And oddly enough, the perspective among a lot of people was that if Y2K didn't happen, then somehow the Bible must be wrong about something. It's so weird. I'm still not over that. But prophecy publishing kind of went off a cliff, starting January 2nd, 2000, But it also was changing because of the attitudes of the rising leadership, okay? I think it's been said, and I got you out for lunch, so I'm going to get you out for dinner too. At the time Rick Warren, let me say this real quick. Today is not going to be an expose or a diatribe against Rick Warren. I'm just using this for illustrative purposes. At the time he got his PhD from Fuller in 1980, there were basically just a handful of mega churches in this country, defined as 2,000 members or more. Now there's 5,000. He's largely responsible for that. And that's when things really started to change. And this coincided with a desire among publishers in the Christian community to become more corporate-minded and follow more secular business practices. In other words, what I'm trying to get at is they were all about making money, okay? Making disciples, not so much. They said that publicly because that's what you put in your advertising materials. But they didn't believe a word of it. They wanted to make money. It's about bottom line. And so in about the mid-'90s, I started noticing some odd things happening. I can't remember if I told this story the last time here or not, but it bears repeating. I remember one summer convention, we did the big annual international book show for Christian Booksellers Association, CBA. So I always loved to, the first morning, to walk around the floor and look at what people were doing, what new books were coming out. And, the joke at the place where I worked was Jim's interested in a book if it's a German theology from the 17th century. So I had to get up to speed on commercial viability and stuff like that. And so I would walk around and see what everybody's doing. And one year, I think it was 96 or 7, I'm walking down one aisle and there's a table or a booth for somebody called Health Communications. Well, they had 1, maybe 2 books in print, but it was a chicken soup books. So I instantly wondered, what in the world is Health Communications doing in an evangelical book trade show? Because I had read the first one, and that's the last one I ever read. Because one of the essays was, whoever the author was writing about the golden Buddha in all of us. What? So this was being peddled in evangelical mainstream circles. This was being sold in chain bookstores. Name any chain bookstore that you want to. I'll name one that's now defunct, Family Christian Stores. And because I can say whatever I want, mostly I've reached that age where I can, I'm going to develop into a crazy old guy. I just say stuff and I don't care, But they started selling anything that was popular. And it was interesting that the publishers were driving what the consumers bought, and the consumers were driving what the publishers produced. It was a two-way street. And so this golden Buddha essay, what is that? I mean, you can't put that stuff in. I mean, that's leaven. It really was. Now, especially back then, if you said something like this to the higher-ups, they would put you in a rubber room because you're not playing ball. You're not, this is about marketing, about selling product. So I wrote to the president of CBA and I said, hey, as in, you're probably not aware of this, but Health Communications was at the show. Well, he sent me a letter and his attorney sent me a letter. And they basically told me that, we kind of can't keep them out. So they have as much right to be here as anybody. Well, I knew the gig was up then, or the jig was up. And so I began to really see a change in offerings from Christian book publishers. Now, a big part of this story, and I'm going to use a term later, and I forget who coined this. I want to give him credit, but I can't remember. The Evangelical Industrial Complex, the EIC. I remember when Ike talked about this at one point late in his political career. He talked about the military industrial complex, basically warning people that, hey, there are people out there that don't have your best interests at heart. Well, the same kind of entity absolutely exists within evangelicalism today. I'm sorry, but it does. And they control the narrative, okay? They control the information flow into churches in America, straight up. This is not in one denomination. It's not in a couple of associations. It's across the board. Southern Baptists, AG, whatever they are, literally thank God for Calvary chapels. This is who I recommend to people when increasingly people say, I can't find a church, do you know somebody? Teaching the Bible verse by verse and making disciples, etc., is the way to have a healthy church. But there are other people who believe that the way to have a healthy church is to make it aesthetically pleasing to people, have amusements, as Spurgeon looked ahead and saw in the church. And so the problem is that it's not so much a model that's used for doing church. The problem is the model true? Is it good? If it isn't, then you got a real problem. And I'm just going to tell you that, in my opinion, much of the megachurch model today is flawed, the seeker-driven type stuff. Now, I'm not here to talk in depth about Rick Warren or Andy Stanley or any of the others so much, but I find it fascinating that Warren is based on the West Coast. Bill Hybels of the Willow Creek Association is right in the Midwest, and Andy Stanley is on the East Coast. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? That is just such a coincidence. They blanket the country. So whatever these three men are writing, podcasting, whatever they're doing, disseminating information, all churches don't just have that made available to them, but there's sort of a system in place where you're going to take that or you get nothing, Think about Lifeway stores that I mentioned earlier. Lifeway is the publishing arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, the biggest Protestant denomination in the world. And whatever Lifeway is selling, that church is getting, period. And so controlling the narrative is a big, big piece of this puzzle. If you want to understand what's going on in the church today, it's because there's a group of people that decide what programs are going to be, what the literature is going to be, and that sort of thing. It just so happens that none of these men, they're certainly not pro-Israel, and they either are indifferent to or de-emphasize Bible prophecy teaching. They emphasize other stuff. It was I think it was 20 years ago, that this cover appeared on Christianity Today magazine. Now, CT is, I guess, the flagship periodical of the evangelical world. Started in the 50s by Billy Graham, of course, to just report on what's happening in the Christian world around the world. And I'm sure it started with good intentions. But they left that behind a long time ago. And by the way, a lot of the things that I'm saying right now, nobody will say out loud. But if people don't know, then people don't know, right? So again, if you want to understand why things are the way they are, there are reasons. Now, this particular cover story and the inside story itself was just a classic hatchet job on pro-Israel Christians, on Christian Zionism, because let me tell you something. The CT editorial staff then and now, they don't like Christian Zionists, period. So they have these caricatures, they're mocking, making fun of first Benjamin Netanyahu, who was in his first term as prime minister. There's Hal Lindsey cleverly pushing back on a globe, the late great planet Earth. There's Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and Tim LaHaye in lockstep behind Netanyahu. In other words, these evangelical leaders are compromised because they're going to do whatever Israel wants them to do. So it was an attack on the Israel narrative, Remember this morning I talked about the Palestinian narrative? Well, this was the beginning of advancing that by attacking the Israel narrative. And so they accomplished this largely by attacking Bible prophecy teachers. There has been a very coordinated, choreographed effort to damage Israel and her Christian supporters for a very long time. This is an extremely sophisticated apparatus that works this continuously, okay? And I always think about it like this, which to me this is pretty interesting. Like you and I think most of us are working people. You have a job, you go to the job, you're raising a family, you're doing this stuff, you're paying your bills and doing, you're handling these responsibilities. Well, our ideological enemies, and I call them enemies, they don't have jobs like that. Their jobs always advance a leftist agenda. Whether they're in media, politics, religion, whatever it is, whatever they're doing, they have time to do this 24 hours a day, literally, and they do. So while you're working all day and then coming home and cooking supper and then sleeping and then, fulfilling your obligations, they're writing stuff like this. Okay? They have, the wind is in their sails. The spirit of the age is with them, right? The German word, the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the age is with them. And so, for example, CT could turn out a hit piece like this, but no pushback from evangelical leaders. Not a word. So they have free rein to say whatever they want. This is when I began to see pro-Israel support in the beginning stages of decline in the church. Now, I talked quite a bit about the Southern Baptist Convention, the SBC, the shift. Now, as I said earlier, growing up, pro-Israel was just foundational in the Southern Baptist churches. It was just everywhere. If we weren't having conferences, there was all kinds of literature and books, and, the pastors were supportive. Not anymore. The 45,000 churches, well, let me put it this way. A good friend of mine is a former SBC pastor. He pastored a large church for a long time, and he finally left. And so we were talking a couple of years ago about, gatherings like this. And he said, well, if I were to come up with a list for you of churches that would host something like that, I would have to think a long, long, long time. And he meant across the country, not just in his region. He said, I honestly couldn't name for you right now a pastor that would. Let's be honest. The reason for that is because a lot of those local pastors, and let me qualify that by saying there are many good pastors left in this country, and there are thousands of good churches still left, but they're like this. But the pastors who are on the seeker-driven train and the marketing train and who see Craig Groeschel at Life Church and want to be like him, they're taking their cues from the leadership. And the leadership is not pro-Israel and not Bible prophecy. So that's what happened to the SBC. That's just what happened. So here's a tweet by Ed Stetzer. He's referring to the SBC convention 2 years ago. And he said, "First time I've ever seen Southern Baptists pushing back against supporting Israel and hearing from an Arab Christian, changing times." Ed Stetzer's not just telling you what happened. I'm convinced Ed Stetzer thinks that's a good thing because he's part of the leadership. Now, this will take a minute, but I'm going to read you all of his titles because he, a couple of years ago, left Lifeway Research. He was in charge of Lifeway Research, doing all the polling data for the convention. He left that to go to Wheaton, and he is now the Billy Graham Distinguished Chair of Church Mission and Evangelism at Wheaton College and Executive Director of the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College. He is the North American Regional Director for Lausanne International and serves as interim teaching pastor at Moody Church in Chicago, Illinois. Point being, Ed Stetzer is a major player. And Ed Stetzer is a big reason why certain things are pushed in evangelical circles today. And it's not going to be Israel. Here's an example of how offshoot things affect the big picture. This is one of many elements that are contributing to the problem I'm describing. Jonathan Merritt is the son of former Southern Baptist President James Merritt in Atlanta. Jonathan Merritt, a couple of years ago, moved to New York City, where he writes for several high-profile platforms, Religion News Service and some others. And he's been given some big platforms. Jonathan Merritt, although he would very much take exception to this, is left-wing. Okay? I don't know what to tell you other than that. He's very much part of the movement to move millennials away from traditional church and traditional conservative values. He tweeted recently, and notice the fact that he's citing a Christianity Today story. Remember what I said about discover the networks? You have to pay attention to the linkage, the connectivity of everything. All of this stuff is connected, okay? He's promoting a CT article that says, as American evangelicals are changing colors, so is Zionism. Well, first of all, they're lauding the fact that American evangelicals are changing colors, meaning evangelicals are softening on social issues. So they're lauding that. I can tell you they're gleeful about this. And then, okay, Zionism's changing too, see, according to them. I can't emphasize enough the network here. It is systemic. Everything is linked. So that I was talking to somebody earlier. Guys like us who write some prophecy books and write books about Israel. A generation, 2 generations ago, you had it was difficult, but you almost had your pick of publishers who would publish your book. And, they would do publicity and you'd have speaking engagements and stuff like that. Not anymore. What is the old saying? I can't even get arrested. I mean, people with that worldview are pariahs in evangelical leadership. Okay? They are. And so you don't have the platforms that they have. I'm not crying about that. I'm just telling you the way it is. There's a key person, Dr. Russell Moore, of the SBC's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. He took over for Richard Land 5 years ago. Richard Land was, Dr. Land, I think always identified as pro-Israel. He was somewhat old school, that the Jerry Falwell era. Land made some comment on his radio show 5 years ago about the Trayvon Martin case, and it wasn't politically correct. They yanked him off the air immediately. And the next thing you know, he's retiring from the ERLC, and they brought in Russell Moore. Well, Russell Moore is another of these change agents. He's not an Israel guy. I think he thinks Bible prophecy is kind of wacky. In fact, what he's doing here, and they love. There's a word they actually use, winsome. They love being winsome. They'll actually say that. You need to be winsome in the culture so people will be more accepting. So he knows that the spirit of the age is with him, so he can make fun of Bible prophecy and get away with it. Now, the example he uses is a goofy book. Remember the 1988 book, Will Christ Return 1988? Well, look, there's, if you're talking about Harold Camping Camping's not he's not a serious Bible prophecy teacher. This guy wasn't either. But you see what they're doing? This is intentional. This is not, he didn't just not think about this. What he's saying is prophecy teachers are kind of nutty. Russell Moore knows exactly what he's doing. And if you go back and you read his old blog posts, there's plenty of material you can sift through, and you'll see exactly what he thinks about Israel. He would tell you, of course, he's not anti-Israel, but see for yourself. The other thing about him, which goes to the core of this Christian media thing, he's a never-Trumper on steroids. And he spent 2016 just castigating Trump every chance he got. And so I started noticing that Russell Moore had op-eds published in the Washington Post and New York Times. I thought, wow. Now think about that. Think about that. If you're an evangelical leader and the New York Times and the Washington Post want you to write something for them, oh my goodness. Wow, you need to think about that. Well, he's not thinking about it. He's one of them. Some of the speakers you've had here over the years, do you think they would be invited by the New York Times to write an op-ed on Christian Zionism? Of course not. So this tells you where they're at. Moore is one of them. They can count on him to carry water for left-wing ideology. This is another Twitter message, a tweet by Danny Akin. Akin is a Southern Baptist Seminary president. Listen to what he is retweeting from somebody else, and he says, good word and reminder, thank you. Now, here's what the guy wrote. White Christians should remember that they worship a brown-skinned, Aramaic-speaking Palestinian man seated at the right hand of the Father. Can you believe we live in a time like this? Jesus is not a Palestinian. He was never a Palestinian. Does he love Palestinians? Of course. Danny Akin knows better. What he's doing is signaling that he agrees with that ideology, which is anti-Bible. Good word. Unbelievable. A Palestinian man is seated at the right hand of the Father. He runs in circles with Russell Moore and Albert Mohler in that group. Now, what I call the EIC, Evangelical Industrial Complex book distribution. This is very important to understand. Because this, I could call Warren, Hybels, and Stanley a trifecta. That's not a bad word. That's what it is. It starts with them. And by the way, the Willow Creek Association is probably the most influential evangelical organization in the world. The Willow Creek Church in Chicago that the Hybels started in 1975, vast influence across the globe. It all works together, okay? It filters all the way down to the Christian bookstores, Lifeway, Family when they were still open, all the others. They all carry these guys' books. They'll carry whatever sells. It's just the way it is. Now, just like I said a minute ago, there are a lot of good pastors left. There are a lot of good Christian bookstore owners left. And it's a ministry, and thank God for them, because they do good stuff and they stock good material, but they are not the norm. Not at all. The vast majority of Christian bookstores stock garbage because it sells. This is off subject, but stuff like Jesus Calling, The Shack, all that stuff. They do it because it sells, and they got to pay the light bill. They got to stay open. So, this group that controls the narrative manages to work with groups and individuals under them. It is almost like a pyramid scheme in a way. These books were at a Catalyst conference in Dallas a few years ago that I attended. And one of the things that's become popular in these circles is you've got to do a book with a provocative title. So anytime you can put the word naked in a title, that's very winsome, and it's probably going to help move some books. Not surprisingly, Brian McLaren did this a few years ago. His book Naked Spirituality, and his quote salvation story, and it will scare you, by the way, if you ever read the book. Naked spirituality, all that kind of stuff. The passion word is used constantly. Now, I'm not a prude. I'm not saying that some words aren't, correct. But when that is their stock and trade, again, it's just... And so they produce these books with... The real goal is to build the brand of the author. And I say author in quotes. A lot of them couldn't write a word if you put a gun to their head. They produce these books to sell, to build their brand, and they front load every conference, every Christian book catalog that you get in the mail, every bookstore with their books. So at the Catalyst Conference, which was also promoting contemplative spirituality and some New Age stuff that I picked up, they have a bookstore there. And they have up to maybe 15,000 pastors and youth leaders at 3 different conferences through the year. And their mailing list is much bigger than that. They've burrowed so deep into the evangelical churches, you wouldn't believe it. So this is the kind of stuff people are consuming, not Paul Smith's book, not a Dave Hunt title, et cetera, et cetera. That stuff was, they couldn't do that. The box of books on the right is my Catalyst order with William Paul Young's new book on top. He was the author of The Shack. This is the kind of stuff they promote. On the left is a Harper One publisher's booth at CBA one year. Harper One is the spirituality publishing imprint of HarperCollins, parent company. And so there you can get stuff from people like Brian McLaren, You could get books there today from that were written by Karl Barth, the old theologian who coined the term true myth. that you can kind of call some things in the Old Testament myth, but they're telling a story, so it's kind of true myth. Anyway, this is the kind of stuff that they produce. InterVarsity Press a couple of years ago released a title called The Israel-Palestinian Conflict by a woman named Dale Hansen Burke. So this is an IVP title. I promise you it's pro-Palestinian. I read it. She is involved pretty deeply in promoting the Palestinian narratives with people like Lynn Hybels, May Cannon, formerly World Vision, Sammy Awad. I don't think you can see it, but on this Facebook post, I posed the question to them, where is Palestine? And the IVP rep answered, that can be a tricky question, Jim, and Dale wrote this book exactly for questions like that. No on both counts. It's not a tricky question. It's an easy question. It's an easier answer. Palestine doesn't exist in our world today, but it is a political term to hurt Israel. And secondly, she wrote the book to advance the Palestinian agenda. Gary Burge, longtime Wheaton professor, a longtime Israel critic. He's written several books. This one, Whose Land, Whose Promise, which of course is not going to come down on the side of Israel, either politically or biblically. I had an interesting conversation a few years ago with a friend who lives in Ephrat, which is between Jerusalem and Hebron. And he was telling me, he went into his bedroom and got this stack of business cards because we were having this conversation about this stuff. And he said, wait a minute, I recognize that name. So he goes in and he's flipping through these cards and he comes to Gary Burge's card. Well, Gary Burge is taking tour groups to that place. Remember that place I told you about, Israel, Palestine? He takes people there to push the Palestinian narrative and to demonize Israelis. And so my friend said, well, when they come back from Hebron, they stop here at my house. And they want me to, kind of discuss a little bit of what they've seen. But he said what they really want to do is he wants to show them a, quote, crazy Israeli settler. And he'll tell them that my friend is squatting on Palestinian land that Israel stole. This is what he does. Here's a new book by May Cannon that I mentioned. She's left World Vision, which is anti-Israel. And she's now director for Churches for Middle East Peace. She's the editor of this book, A Land Full of God, and it's going to be another Palestinian view of the conflict. Notice the contributors are Bill Hybels, Desmond Tutu, Daryl Bach of DTS, David Gushy, Eugene Cho, Jim Wallace, David Neff, John Perkins, Paul Alexander, Pope Francis, and Tony Campolo. All of the people I just mentioned, except for Daryl Bach, are hardcore left-wing. So what do you think the book's about? I mean, are you kidding me? You would contribute to a book that Desmond Tutu contributed to? I remember once somebody asked him, the bishop, met him in South Africa and asked him to explain the great question of where does evil and pain come from? He basically said, I don't know. Why would you listen to anything that guy had to say? And why would you contribute a chapter in a book that he was in? But this is what is coming into evangelical circles. Not Catholic, not mainline churches. Evangelical. Charisma magazine. Charisma has always been pro-Israel. Steve Strang, the publisher, has a reputation for that. But here is a review of the movie Little Town of Bethlehem, which was anti-Israel. It's little things like this are starting to appear. That's the flagship of the Pentecostal world, charismatic world. Steve Strang on the right, his son Cameron on the left. I mentioned Cameron earlier. They're holding their respective magazines, Relevant and Charisma. Here you see that this in living color is the generational divide on the Israel question. You have Cameron going to the left, Steve is on the right. That's fascinating to me, because what Joel Rosenberg said that I mentioned this morning is going to happen. It is going to happen. The next generations will turn against Israel. And think about that however you want to do that prophetically. Another Christianity Today thing, the title of the piece is Evangelicals Defend Christ at the Checkpoint from Israeli Critics. Christ at the checkpoint can't be defended if you have any moral compass. It's a left-wing PLO weapon used to bash Israel. But there's Christianity Today promoting it. You know, a lot of the CT editors over the years, David Neff, Mickey Maudlin, these guys are so far on the left, you wouldn't believe it. They've been printing stuff like this for a very long time. To give you an example of how their worldview informs what they do, I remember this back in the 90s. It was between our two wars in the Gulf. And so it was after the first Gulf War, and they were doing a short piece on Iraq and the Christians over there, and they actually kind of made a defense for Tariq Aziz. Remember that guy who was a mouthpiece for the regime? Just an evil dude. You know, he was the Heinrich Himmler of Saddam's inner circle. They were like defending the guy, saying that he was a Christian. Really? This is how CT softens people up, because people go, oh, well, wait a minute, he was a Christian. Well, okay, you know. Finally, and if we have a few minutes, if you have questions, I'll answer them, and otherwise we'll be finished. And remember to stop by the table and visit with me if you want, and sign up for our newsletter. Finally, which I have spoken about here before, the Little Town of Bethlehem film done in 2010. This is Jim Hannon, the director, at the offices of EGM Films, based in Oklahoma City, based at Hobby Lobby headquarters. Why Hobby Lobby? Because Mark Green, one of the Green family, financed the movie. Remember when I told you earlier the film that proposed that it was balanced because they interviewed a Muslim, a Palestinian Christian, and an Israeli, except they were all left-wing Israel haters? That's this movie. So what are they doing producing a film like that? Well, it's because they're part of this evangelical industrial complex that is marching in lockstep with the same ideology that's moving to the left all the time. And so I'm going to finish this by saying I didn't intend to make this use this example, but if it helps you to think about it like this. What I'm getting at is that Christian media have changed so dramatically in the last generation that if they are making orthodox statements on social issues today, they won't be tomorrow. They will come out as fully left-wing pretty soon. And you know what I mean about social issues. They're going to do it. They're just like Obama. They're floating a trial balloon. Obama believed the way he believed when he was 20 years old. He didn't change his positions on certain things in his second term in the White House. He just said he did, because he had to fool people to get there in the first place. America's evangelical leaders, many of them are doing exactly the same thing today. They're telling people largely what they want to hear right now, but 6 months from now, 5 years from now, they will come out of their own closets, so to speak, in terms of left-wing ideology, which at its core is anti-Israel and anti-Jew. So, thank you very much. I don't know, do we have time for questions? Or
Yeah, we got a few minutes. Any questions? So, any observations or questions?
if not, thank you very much.
Wait, I have a question.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so you were talking about Bill Hybels. I know that Lee Strobel was part of that church at one time. What do you say about Lee Strobel?
I think Lee Strobel's done a lot of good work. A lot of his apologetic stuff is really top shelf. Has been responsible, I'm certain, for conversions and good things. Where it is on the Israel stuff, first of all, it's two things. He has to be influenced to some degree by the Hybels, but on the other hand, that's also just not his thing, So I see him as I don't have an issue with Lee Strobel. He's done some good stuff.
Well, I know he's in Texas now. He's not even.
Yeah. I think he has a new book coming out on the resurrection, I believe. Miracles? Okay.
I have a couple questions.
Yes.
Well, one of those books that you shared with Compassion was Louis Giglio. I thought he had some good messages. I've heard him on the radio, but is that book kind of not a representation of his messages, or why was that book up there? Do you know much about that book in particular?
My answer is they're all moving in the same direction.
Like Sarah Young, Jesus Calling, I've read that devotional. I kind of got away from that because I felt like the Bible was better at delivering that message, right?
Anybody that wants to know about Jesus Calling, read Warren Smith's stuff. If some of you know about Warren Smith, he'll
Okay.
yeah.
Uncover it to expose it? Or
Yeah. Now, Louis Giglio himself, he would, somewhat like my answer to Lee Strobel, a lot of these people, their intentions are pure. Their motives are pure. I mean, to spread the gospel at conferences, you can't argue with that. The problem, at least for me, is where are they going in their network and their associations and where they're going to end up. So, yes?
James Merritt, is he leftist too, or is it just his son? If so, what do you think of his son?
Well, I should have mentioned this in the presentation. This could be an entire presentation. James Merritt is orthodox in his beliefs, but this is another fascinating area of research. If you look at the top evangelical leaders in this country today, very much the majority of them, the sons have gone completely the other direction. And in many cases, the sons are influencing the fathers. The sons are mentoring the fathers. So while James Merritt may have pure motives for building the church and relating to millennials, those are good things. What he's hearing from his son is going to get him off track. I'm sorry, but that's just the case. And you'll also notice that guys like that, when the son does say something crazy in print or he takes a really liberal position, silence from the father. No comment. And I could name a dozen of those guys. Anybody else? Yes?
I read a Facebook post from somebody we know that had a good 4-year education at well anyway, what he said was that the LGBT movement is
Yes. Yes, it is. But notice something. That it's the fastest growing movement? Really? What's your data on that? See, the left says stuff. Okay, let me say it another way. The left lies
Yes.
because it advances their agenda. They can say anything. They can say, gorillas are coming into the church, and so we have to tailor what we do to gorillas. No, they're not. But you hear that and you go, oh, man, well, how am I going to relate to gorillas? That's what's going on in the evangelical circles. But yes, the answer is yes. Evangelical leaders today, almost all of them, and even the good ones, are concerned about the exodus from the church by millennials. That's happening. I mean, they want people in the church for the right reasons. They want to reach people with the gospel. But they don't understand that the only way to do that is preach the word. It's Scripture. The gospel is in the Bible. And if you're giving them programs and topical sermons on how to have better finances, you're not meeting their spiritual needs. So that group and 6 or 7 others like them that would be on the left, they don't need us to make them comfortable. They need the gospel. And that's but the evangelical church is very much about programs and new models on how to cater to people like that.
Spoke about controlling information. One of my pastors at the Methodist Church in Plainfield said that they meet once a year for 4 hours, maybe a couple times a year, just to make sure the message is okay. The message is, along with the Methodist commercial church or whatever.
Yeah, that's in the book of Acts.
Like, I'm really about free speech as a pastor, should be free to say what he wants to say, but I don't know what goes on.
Well, they should be, but the Methodists have a little different system. They're appointed by the bishop, and there's a lot of things, moving parts there. But I can believe that they do that because they're going to stay on message and they're going to stay politically correct.
One more? Anybody?
Okay, thank you.